Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. My name's Susan Leahy. I'm the co-director here of the Centre for Crime, Justice and Victim Studies. On behalf of my co-director, Dr. Andrea Ryan, who couldn't be here today, I'd like to welcome you first and foremost to the School of Law, and secondly to this very exciting event which we're having here this morning. It's really fantastic to see so many of you here. I won't keep you too long introducing you to the centre, but the Centre for Crime, Justice and Victim Studies was first set up here 20 years ago as a Centre for Criminal Justice. We renamed it in 2015 as the Centre for Crime, Justice and Victim Studies. So I'm particularly delighted here for today's event, perspectives on hidden victims. And we're very excited really at the moment in particular about this event because we've Dr. Sean Redmond, who's recently joined our staff here on secondment and from the Department of Children, and also Dr. Johnny Connolly, who's here as a postdoctoral researcher. And I think it's really copper-fastened I suppose how innovative our centre is, and given us a new branch to our armour really, which is an increasing interest on victims and on youth justice. So just to introduce this morning's event, it's a two-part programme, as you know, and I think again that's really exciting and very innovative this morning. We have three fantastic speakers, Dr. Sean Redmond and Dr. Johnny Connolly from our own centre, but also I'd like to particularly welcome Dr. Nicola Carr and thank her for making the journey here to be with us, and I'm very excited to hear the three papers. This afternoon, I think, as well, is a really exciting event, and one I'd love to have been involved in if I was a PhD student still myself, which is our masterclass on methodology. And I suppose having supervised PhD candidates and being involved in Viva examinations, method is so important, and in particular when you're dealing with sensitive audiences and people that could potentially either be bettered or harmed by your research. I think having the right method is so important. So it's a really exciting initiative and an innovative initiative, so I hope you all enjoy that in the afternoon. Catherine has asked me to remind you that if you are a tweeter, that we have a hashtag hidden victims, and that you can follow the research that is happening here at the moment in relation to Greentown at Greentown, at 17 Greentown. So make sure you have a look at that. I'm not a tweeter myself, so I won't be of much use to it. So our first speaker this morning is our own Dr. Sean Redmond. His paper is entitled "Why We Should Be Bothered About the Influence That Locally Based Criminal Networks Have on Children." His presentation is based on the Greentown study and the influence of criminal networks on children's offending behaviour in Ireland. That's a study that was conducted between 2010 and 2014. Sean is an adjunct professor of youth justice here at the School of Law, and I'm sure he'll do a far better introduction to his presentation than I will, so I'll hand over to Sean now. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks. Before I start, I just want to say a couple of thank yous. The first thank you is to the Department of Children and Youth Affairs and the Department of Justice and Equality, who funded the original study and are also now funding the follow-on study, and also a process of program design that we hope will try and make some useful interventions in relation to children who are caught up in criminal networks. So these people are usually kind of faceless bureaucrats, but Tony and Paddy, you might just stand up and just show yourselves to the people. I also want to say thank you as well, a particular thanks to colleagues in An Garda Síochána. And as you'll see when we go through the slides, the research, the initial research and the research that we're planning to do certainly couldn't have been done without their full support from the top to the bottom. There's also one other person I want to say thank you to is Barry Coonan, who is the Garda analyst. Barry's sitting around somewhere. There he is there. And even though the study, the Greentown study, has my name over it, it has Barry's imprint, as you'll see when we look at the slides. So I want to say a thank you. One final thank you is to my colleague Owen and Mara Daly. And I know it's customary to say thanks to the people who've organised the events at the end of the event, but I'm very forgetful. And I'm pretty sure that nothing can go wrong now, Owen, so we can plough on with that. Okay, so my story starts back in 2010 when I was the head of young offender programs in the Irish Youth Justice Service. And one of the jobs I had to do, as well as number crunching, was to get out and to talk to people. At that time, the Department of Justice was spending about 16 million on Garda Youth Diversion projects. And a really good source of intelligence was to go out and talk to project leaders and local juvenile liaison officers, local Garda, about what crime looked like in local communities. And this story here was a really kind of compelling one. Back in 2010, we were at a point at which we were starting to get a handle on the data and starting to identify some patterns around youth crime, which were pretty similar to international comparisons. But there was one or two stories that kind of really jarred with me, and this was one of them. And this was from a really seasoned youth worker in Dublin. And she was telling me the story about a 16-year-old boy that she'd been working with over quite a long period of time. And this 16-year-old boy had ran away. The reason he ran away is that he had ran up drug debts with a local drug gang. Not surprising, I suppose. But the last part of the story then, or the next part of the story, was the one that really kind of shook me. I suppose both as a professional involved in policy, but also as a parent as well. That what the youth worker said to me was that his mum had phoned him wherever he was and asked him to come back and take his beating. And it wasn't a beating from the family, it was a beating from the drug gang. And the reason that she'd asked him to come back was that the drug gang had made their life a misery. They had been calling death threats, smashing the place up, and generally making their lives completely miserable. And this kind of ritual of coming back to take the beating was in some way some kind of perverse incentive to make everything okay again. And I actually thought, as I say, as a policymaker, as somebody involved in programs, and particularly as a parent as well, this is like bizarre, even though in some ways you can kind of see the rationale behind it, or that there's some rationale for her asking her son to come back. From a policy point of view, I just felt it was something we couldn't stand over, and it was something that we needed to inquire into a little bit more. So I'll just tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about this morning. I'm going to talk a bit about the context for the study, where it fits in with the rest of youth justice research. I'm going to talk very, very briefly about methodology, which is why it's so small. Methodology I'm going to save for people who are coming to the masterclass this afternoon. I'm going to major on the findings of policy relevance, and I also want to bring you up to speed in relation to the new study and the programme design exercise in 2017. Okay. So I suppose the good thing about the things that we were starting to understand back in 2010, and I think it's still a continuing pattern as well, is that the data seem to indicate that young people grow out of crime. Do you know? So by and large, by the time that young men in particular get to 19, 20, 21, the age crime curve seems to dip, and for whatever reason, young people seem to grow out of crime. Loads of different theories posited for it: brain development, taking on more responsibility, socialization. But the actuarial data, this is based on detections, which obviously has some kind of limitations, but tends to show that the majority of young people grow out of crime. It's a really strong data set as well. So the fact that we have one police service for the whole country means that it's almost like kind of census data. This is all the young people who go through the diversion program who've been detected, and takes us back, I think, Barry, to about 1999. So this is 57,000 individuals born in 1989, I beg your pardon, as they get older. It shows a very clear drop-off. Two things that are important about that. One is it means that our age crime curve isn't dissimilar to a lot of other jurisdictions. But also what it does is underpin a very robust diversion program that An Garda Síochána have been running since about 1963, showing that, basically, if we can get young people through to adulthood with as few scrapes as possible, then probably that's the best and most effective, most efficient response the state can make, as opposed to, in previous years, putting thousands of kids into reformatories. What we also know, though, is that a small number of young people are responsible for a high number of offences. So what this data show is that about 3% or 1,450 young people were linked to 53% of all offences, again using detection data. Again, shows this overall kind of very optimistic picture that most young people who do get in trouble with the law commit 1 or 2 offences, but a very small number of young people are responsible for a higher number of offences. And it's those number of young people that the data set or the data is much poorer about. They're smaller in number, their contexts are pretty unknown. So, in relation to the evidence from the literature, this is my poor attempt at a kind of a figurative bell curve. What it shows is that kind of normal offending for young people, and that either side of that norm, we've got quite a lot of data, numerical data, statistical data. So we know a lot about a lot. You know, so we know a lot about the young people who commit 1 or 2 or 3 offences, both in terms of the mainstream literature and also in terms of our data as well. So this is the kind of literature that brings about the risk and protection paradigm, or the risk approach to working with young people, which, you know, pretty robust really for young people who fit within that kind of that large category of young people. Also would be the kind of target group for evidence-based programs, because, you know, a lot of the young people present with pretty doable issues that can, you know, where interventions are pretty straightforward. The problem we have is with the small number of young people that I indicated, who have been referred to in the literature as the right-hand tail of the bell curve, if you like, who are involved in, as we've seen earlier, quite high degrees of offending behaviour, and about whose context is known very little about. Within that group then, there's a literature on criminal networks and communities. So in addition to the typical risk factors, anybody who's read Farrington and the likes will talk about low impulsivity, you know, parent ineffectiveness, delinquent peers, dropping out of school, early drug usage. But in addition to those, what this kind of literature talks about, usually smaller studies, are the pull factors or the opportunities for social capital for young people to get involved in crime. The push factors, where there may be coercion. Niamh Hourigan talks about this idea of contested sovereignty, where in some neighbourhoods that even though there may be an official presence in relation to statutory agencies, the sovereignty is really contested by some other kind of powerful sources within the community, usually criminal gangs. But also then cultural factors which discourage pro-social behaviour, ambiguous relationships between residents and criminals, almost a natural order. See, Andrew's here now. I had a very kind of sobering conversation with Andrew used to be based in a Garda project in Limerick, and we were talking all the time there about how it was important to try and encourage young people to engage in pro-social behaviour. And one of the things he said to me was, that's all very well and fine. I don't know if you remember the conversation, Andrew, but you know, most of the kids that this young person is working with don't. And so he stands out like a sore thumb. So in a kind of counterintuitive way, the young person acting pro-socially is othered by the other young people that he's mixing with. And then finally, the kind of Greentown study is the first Irish study of its type in terms of using initially kind of Garda data to try and bound a picture of what a network looks like, and then examining that using qualitative techniques. So I said I wasn't going to mention much about the methodology. This is going to come up in the afternoon. But it's safe to say that we used a sampling technique which basically used offence types to try and identify a location, which ended up being Greentown. We used that data then to build a network map. I say we, my colleague Barry Cahunan built it and provided me with a network map. All of the data was provided by the guards. So whether it was statistical data or data gleaned through interview, the Garda members were my data points locally in Greentown. We used a protocol that we developed specifically for the study called Twin Sight, which I won't discuss now, but we're going to discuss this afternoon, which permitted us to be able to talk about individual cases without breaching confidentiality and anonymity requirements. used grounded theory and the constant comparative method to develop some themes. So that's the methodology, so I'm going to deal much more detail this afternoon. We're going to talk about the findings now. And the first finding was that there was a network operating in Greentown, and it included transactions and relationships between adults and children. For anybody who's read the report, you'd think, so what? Well, we know that now. But actually, when we set out on the study, what we had was the stories from the youth worker who was talking about the young man who had to come back and take his beating, and other anecdotes. That wasn't an isolated one. But also some data, or a hypothesis based on some types of offending behaviour where we thought that it was pretty unlikely that children and young people were likely to carry out that type of offence on their own. So we looked at burglary offences and drugs for sale and supply. There's more data on burglary offences because it's more easily detectable. But with both of those offences, we hypothesised that there needed to be some kind of collaboration, and it was likely that that collaboration could involve adults. So we didn't know when we set out. But this is the Greentown Network, and you might just permit me a bit of time. Take a look at it, and just permit me a little bit of time just to go through it, because it's important to just suppose deal with the detail on this. So it was prepared by Garda analysts at Garda headquarters in Dublin without any input from the researcher or from the local Gardaí. It was constructed linking individuals through common incidents involving both minors and adults. All the individuals had an address in Greentown sub-district during 2010 and 2011, and all offences occurred within the Greentown sub-district, so it was contained. The green link indicates that one or more burglary offences link the respective individuals. A red link indicates that one or more drugs for sale and supply offences link the respective individuals, and a blue link indicates another relevant crime type which link the individuals, which interestingly the Garda analysts put in for me because I think they thought that I wasn't going to make certain connections. They were trying to help me along. In fact, those connections were made, but that's the reason why the blue connections are there. Each network member was labelled with a unique identifier which took the form of a capitalised letter followed by a numeral such as A1, B1 and C1, and a colour denoting the gender and the individual's actual age and years. So there's 31 individuals, which is a combination of children and adults. One of the interesting things about this was bearing in mind that none of the local guards had an input into this. This was a desk exercise done by Garda analysts just on the basis of pulse data. One of the things I spoke to the guards about when I started the interviews was, give me a score out of 10. How accurate is this in terms of a picture of what actually happens? And they give it a score of about 7.5 on average. They said, it's pretty accurate actually. For somebody who doesn't know what's going on here, this is what actually happens. One of the things I should say, of course, is that there are two versions of this network. The one that the guards saw also had the names on it, so it wasn't just unique identifiers. But they also said that there were key bits of information that were missing in terms of making links, in terms of things like familial relationships, friendships, and other stuff that didn't make it onto the network. So the point I made, one of the points I made in the study was that even if we do nothing else, this is a really, really useful way of being able to map out the potential kind of risk areas for young people who are involved in very serious offending using an evidence-based technique. I don't know how costly it is in staff hours, but for the small number of young people who are involved in multiple offending, whether we think there may be adult collaboration, it's a really, really useful tool, even to get local officers or local support agencies to be able to mobilise around young people and try to help them to protect them. So this network map was closely examined by guards. There were 16 very experienced local guards that were chosen actually by the Chief Super because they had good knowledge of the individuals involved. And we used this network map to examine the relationships between them. And I think one of the things that's kind of different from this study than a lot of ethnographic studies is that it does bound it. It tries to kind of enumerate the number of people who are involved in this network rather than talking about themes in a vacuum. So here's what we found next. What we found was that the network was hierarchical. It generated powerful processes and underpinned a culture of compliance in Greentown. And this culture, in turn, helped to sustain the network. So when you look at a network like the one I showed you, you could be forgiven for thinking that it's pretty flat. It's two-dimensional. We're all involved in networks, whether it's a kind of work thing or, some kind of sports club, the kind of things you can kind of join and then drop out. So when you actually look at the network, it looks fairly two-dimensional, fairly flat, and our next finding was that it certainly wasn't flat at all. And also, it wasn't the kind of network that you can kind of opt in and opt out of. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that now, partly through a few case vignettes, but then also through some of the themes that we found as well. So the main person in this network is a person we called A2. And A2 was unambiguously the leader of the network. I got to a situation where he was pretty distant from committing offences. There was a whole mythology around him. I was talking to Kieran in the car on the way up, and I've only just become aware of this kind of idea of memes on the social media, this idea, this kind of spirit. And A2 enjoyed this kind of mythological, subliminal quality that generated this kind of climate of fear in Greentown. He operated a money lending operation, which quite apart from the transactional kind of practice, also brought about obligations and repayments of debt. So it started generating these client-patron relationships. He used enforcement by middle-ranking associates, so he himself wasn't involved in enforcing any of the contract or enforcing any punishment. He was also seen to shape young people's behaviour as well. Young people looked up to him, revered him. And at a distance now, I wouldn't know him that well. But I suppose from a community point of view, that residents and network members self-govern their behaviour. So it didn't have to actually, give a lot of effort to actually monitoring, controlling people. People tended to self-govern based on this culture that he'd created. And also, as you'll see now, gained the relationship with the Gardaí. He didn't have a fractious relationship with the guards at all. He had a very, on the surface of it, convivial relationship. B2, so A2, sorry, one of the things I wanted to mention was that A2 was a member of a core family, and that was a big distinction in relation to the study. And we'll see that there are two kind of categories of family and non-family, which I called associates. B2 was a family member who was 15 years old, was seen by many of the guards who I interviewed as the natural heir to this network. He was seen as using the family brand to underpin his social capital. So a lot of the grown-up residents, with their own families, will be scared of B2 because of the family brand. He was revered and feared by children on the home estate. So there's this kind of ambiguity that some of the guards talk about, which is some of the young people wanted to be with him, but also were kind of scared of him as well. That he's been cultivated to be less impulsive and have better self-management skills, it's not to attract the attention of the guards. And he mixed more with family members than associates. So even though he had a relationship with some of the kids who were involved in criminal activity, he tended to mix more with his own family and was involved in reprimanding others for behavioural breaches. D2 was another family member who was a 12-year-old, was seen as being encouraged in criminality, but was also sheltered. So a bit like B2 may have been seen as a bit of a risk in terms of impulsive behaviour, as being kind of sheltered. Has authority vastly disproportionate to his age, so would be seen as having a huge amount of authority in the locality that he lived in. I should just say, by way of a kind of by way of a sideline, that this is kind of anathema to me. My job before this was assistant director in Bernardo, so involved in children. So it's a very difficult thing to listen to this kind of commentary about children and young people. But I think genuinely the guards were feeling that the children who were involved in this did have this kind of effect on other community members of carrying this family brand and creating this kind of culture of fear. The model relationship with the guards on A2 and that children and adult residents were afraid was seen also as recruiting associate children to the network. So our first kind of associate is D1. D1 was the one who I thought, when I first looked at this network, was the one who was the centre. Sometimes when you do these kind of analysis, you look at the number of link points, and D1 was the one that stuck out. But actually, D1 was part of the middle management, along with A1 and D1, and up there in the left-hand corner as well. D1, A1, and E1 all came from very chaotic family circumstances, which is in direct contrast to A1, A2, B2 and D2, who, even though they're involved in high levels of criminality, seem to have a very close kind of family and supportive family relationship. This was very chaotic, involved in crime from a very early age. D1 really didn't have much choice. He lives in a housing park where not many people move in and out, and his older siblings were involved in crime with A2. He lives close to A2, so he lives in close geographical proximity, and the reason why he's got so many lines next to him for detections is he gets caught a lot. D1 wouldn't be seen as part of the inner circle in relation to the network, but would be used by A2 for certain jobs and also for enforcement. And with another middle-ranking person in the network, A1, would have been responsible for grooming children into the network. And I usually use the word grooming purposely because the same processes that I understand predatory behaviour for sexual offences occur is exactly the same as this. Winning people's confidence, trying to entice them into certain types of behaviour was exactly the same. I do think it's kind of grooming behaviour. F2, also an associate, very prolific offender, lives close to A1, another chaotic family background, and was involved with a burglary with an uncle at a very early age. He led a group of young people involved in burglaries and robberies and was significantly under the influence of D1 and A1. So part of his kind of entry into the network was a kind of party lifestyle, consumption of large amounts of drugs and alcohol with network adults. This guy here we call the little fella, and the little fella actually didn't appear on the network at all because he's too young. 12. I think he was younger than 12 when we were talking about him. But the reason he didn't make it on there was because he was below the age of below the criminal age, but he was kind of forced on there by the people I interviewed, who said, look, we need to talk about this young person. We're really worried about him. He's going on this awful trajectory now. He's a very chaotic family background. His mom had a drug problem, and dad wasn't present either. He'd spent time in residential care outside of Greentown, and during the time he was in residential care, A1 visited his mom just to keep that relationship going, so that when he came back from residential care, pretty seamlessly he went back into serious crime again. And he was called the little fella because he was small and was used in committing burglaries. So another thing then, I was saying about, something that might come through from the case studies, like say looking at certain people are more important than others. But when we actually looked at the data then, so 400 pages of data we got from the guards, and we actually used NVivo then to trace these unique identifiers and see, well, how often were people mentioned? When we go through all the interviews, we can actually count the number of people who are mentioned. And the people I mentioned there in terms of the case studies are amongst that group there in red, who were mentioned far more than others over the full breadth of interviews. So an indicator that some people might be more important than others. But then also when we looked at doing a kind of a thematic analysis of issues that came up and traced them to unique identifiers, the same individuals you'll see from this pie chart, without exception really, were identified in relation to descriptions of power, leadership, and influence. So the same ones. And you'll see there's a little green one there at the side that says all others combined. So out of a kind of a network of 31, those small number of individuals were mentioned in relation to all these descriptions of hierarchy. We also did another kind of comparison which looked at categorizing individuals within the network about whether they had a blood relationship with the core family or not. And without going into detail, what this is, the blue columns are what we call family members, and the red columns were the non-family members or associates. And we looked at the relationships in relation to certain antisocial measures or antisocial references. And what it came across as is that the family members, tended to be pretty well behaved in relation to the authorities. And a lot of the kids who were involved in associate families had a very, very fractious relationship with authorities and with the guards. So we have an idea there of who the principal actors are of a small number within a larger network. And the other thing from a law enforcement point of view that I think is important is that, as I said, if we were to look at this network from a policy point of view and say who should we focus on our attention on in terms of trying to suppress their activities, it would be D1, of course. It looks far more than prolific offender. And that's what Pulse disclosed. Pulse only disclosed the detections. It was only when we had the added intelligence from the guards that we find out really that the high-profile offenders here are A2, Z1, B2, D2, and F2. They're the ones who are involved, carry the real kind of power in the network. I suppose from, that's kind of interesting from a sociological point of view, but in relation to crime, there's some interesting kind of Greentown national comparisons. And when we look at the data that we looked at before around, the repeat offenders, then only about 8% of young people nationally who are detected for offences commit 5 or more offences. When we look at burglary, which is a good reason, I think, why we picked burglary, that goes up to 15%. Burglary seems to be associated with repeat offending. So all the context that's below that, it's not just the offence category, but the whole context below it. When we look at Greentown, though, there was 75% of the young people involved in 5 or more offences. Now, there's a big kind of, health warning that comes with this, in that the number of children who are involved in the net was quite small. But I think as an indication, it's quite troubling both from a child welfare point of view and also from a law enforcement point of view. This is the Greentown Network and how it linked with what we call the bird's eye view. So the Greentown Network is the one that's in the ring, and the bird's eye view then linked all offences, not just burglary and drugs for sale and supply, but all offences in Greentown over the period. And you can see that outside of burglary offences, there are connections there made by the key actors in the network and large numbers of other people as well. So what we say then is that taken together, the network acted to encourage or compel certain children into abnormal patterns of criminal behaviour. Right, I have a few kind of slides here now that I'm going to skip because I want to stick to my time. I'm going to say something about there, a bit of narcissism. Thumbs up for the lifting that on Greentown. Malcolm Sparrow from Harvard, thoroughly enjoyed reading it. It's nice. Peter Nehru from Cambridge said it's a fascinating piece of work. Andrew Papachristos from Yale has done a lot of work on social network analysis, says it looks amazing. It really does look like a first in many respects, which inspired me to put the unicorn and the rainbow behind it. James Densley's done a lot of this work as well, said great insight into how extra legal governance works with important child exploitation safeguarding implications. Got some different feedback from other people. I looked at the journal.ie because I'm kind of paranoid about these things. When the report was published, I went straight to journal.ie and got some feedback there. Mick Hannigan, why it took him that long to figure that one out, crazy stuff. After 4 days, you could have come to that conclusion. Shaka, 1244, a 4-year study into the bleeding, but it said beading, obvious. I could have saved them 4 years and told them everything in this article that they'd asked. And the last one, Science of Beer. I'm not familiar with his work, but what he said was file under useless pieces of research of the day. Well, there's an interesting kind of relationship there, juxtaposition between, high-minded social science and people who are probably more on a front end, people who know all this is going on. And I suppose what it meant for me then was, what are we going to do about it? People are talking about this stuff, and the people who experience it know exactly what's going on, and they don't need people doing more studies. Having said that, being a social scientist, we do need to do more study. So one of the things we need to do is gauge the national relevance, the national prevalence. So Greentown was a case study, so it was very, very local, and we need to see whether there's any resonance of that across the country as well. And also, one of the things that the Department of Justice and Equality required us to do, and also the guards were very keen on, was to start thinking about designing a new multi-agency intervention to do 2 things. One is about reducing network influence. And a lot of the international studies would say, in order to give these kids a chance, you also need to do something on the law enforcement side to release the pressure a little bit. And the second thing is about improving the resilience of associate children and families to withstanding network threat and improve their life chances. It's not just about remedial, it's about improving the life chances. So just something in relation to the national survey then. So this is currently underway. Catherine Norton is leading on this. Catherine? Catherine, yeah. Catherine's leading on this. She talked to Catherine about it. I'm just going to give you a very brief summary. It works on the assumption that we've got a really good diversion program, really good intelligence that comes through the diversion program, and we are using, in the same way as we used local Garda and Greentown as our data points, we're asking local JLOs who know their populations in their areas to act as data points there. So they have a really good kind of vision of all the young people in their localities, and we'll be able to, when we've constructed a survey based on the findings of the Greentown study, and we're asking them, does this register? To what degree? Do you know? Second thing we're doing is we're doing 2 more case study replications funded by Department of Justice and Equality, and we are actually got the benefit of better technology with this one. So Thomas Grund, Dr. Thomas Grund from UCD has given us a hand with doing some kind of fancier social network analysis. But we actually have a kind of a nostalgic attraction to the old Greentown Network, don't we, Barry? Partly because it kind of, you know, it was the bit that started the work off, but also we actually don't want the network to do too much work for us. We want the conversations with individual Garda to try and fill in the gaps rather than doing too much work. So 2 more case studies. And the next thing then is about the program. So the first thing is about kind of network disruption, and there's a lot being written about this, and a lot of it's kind of theoretical, and a lot of it's kind of limited trials, and 3 main kind of theories around what you do about network disruption. One is take out the top. You know, so well, that doesn't mean kind of take out the top. It means kind of concentrate your energies on the top, and that if you think about policing and other statutory agencies having a finite amount of effort, then your effort is best taken actually getting the person who's involved in the top. So in this case, it would be A2. The second one is going to the bottom, is taking out the foot soldiers, you know, so engaging probably with young people, so it kind of starves the network of a retail capacity that it might not have if there's no people to sell drugs or to commit burglaries. And then another one that says, well, probably what you're better off doing is taking out specific assets, so people who in the network who have specific roles or specific connections, it might be better to identify who they are and to concentrate your efforts on disrupting their behaviour. A lot of this kind of stuff comes from the States. So pretty untested. And the other thing is that when we looked at the kind of Greentown phenomenon, if you like, you know, it's not transitory. This kind of network has been around for 10 to 15 years. So it's part of the cultural fabric, you know, so really difficult to disentangle. So this then, combined with the idea then of an intervention program, is that I suppose the point I'm making is that a lot of this stuff is kind of untested, and there's a kind of an ethical responsibility on us to do some kind of testing of whatever we're going to do. This is a painting from the 1600s by Rembrandt. It's called Storm in the Sea of Galilee, and I often use it for talking about how young people navigate their way through to adulthood. This is a time, Storm in the Sea of Galilee, when they used to go out to sea and they'd be taking on the gods really about whether they ever got to the place they were going to. You know, they'd just, you know, and they'd go out. And so this picture then, I think, is a really good kind of analogy in some ways of what it must be like for a young person having to deal with all the multiple risks that they have to deal with. But since this kind of boat went out, there have been some things, some features that have come about which haven't tamed the tempest at all. They haven't stopped the number of hurricanes or whatever, but we've technologies that have helped to build resilience. So we've maps, we've sextants that help boats to kind of position themselves. We've weather forecasting, you know, so we know now, you know, when it's a good time to go out and probably a bad time when they went out, you know. We also have kind of, new types of craft as well that can, you know, get us through really difficult times, but also through the doldrums as well. We have things called bulwarks or bulkheads as well in boats, which means that if you get holed beneath the waterline, everything's not gone, you know, and also then we have kind of rescue as well, you know. So I suppose the point I'm making is that, you know, rather than, as we would see with a lot of evidence-based programs, is kind of claiming that these programs are kind of self-contained and we can deliver a certain outcome. The reality of the fact is that we're dropping this into quite a dangerous open system, and perhaps one way of thinking about resilience is about how we can use the technologies that we develop in programs to really help that young person negotiate the risks that they face. That being said, though, we also have a responsibility to really test that out. A lot of this is theoretical, and also based on practice wisdom as well. So what we are going to be doing is we've put together a kind of a design team of experts, and we have a number of the Irish experts in the audience who are involved in the kind of practitioner side, also policy and programs and research academics as well. And we're going to do a number of things. The first thing is we're going to identify the problem. If you read any of the stuff around wicked problems, Horst Ruttel, 1973, one of the things he says is really understand what the problem is. Before you come up with a solution, understand what the problem is. It was a really, really sobering conversation with a Garda in Greentown who said, Sean, he said, you can see how complicated this is. What they'll do is open a boxing club. So it's like really understand the problem, all the different kind of facets to it before you come up with a solution, and also get multiple perspectives on that. So we're going to have about 20 to 25 Irish experts giving inputs into what the problem is, and we're going to use Greentown as our focus for that. We also then need to identify what needs to change. So in kind of program building, we call this kind of theory of change. So what needs to change? How might you go about it? Where are the weaknesses in terms of the network, but also what are the kind of things that need to shift in terms of life chances for young people. But then we also use this deliberative process to stress test all the ideas. So a bit like Dragon's Den, as the ideas arise, the international experts then and our national experts will be saying, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Which means then before any program is let loose on the streets, that it will have been through quite a significant deliberative process, not just in relation to stress testing the program, but also in terms of very clearly defining what the problem is and what the theory of change is. So that's me. I'll be talking, let's say, a lot more about the methodology this afternoon, but thanks a million. Cheers.